I'll try to control myself.
All right, so we're live. All right, so Tony, who are you and what do you do?
So as you said, my name is Tony Perez. I am now the head of the security business unit here at GoDaddy. And what that means is all facets of website security, from website backups to SSL to website protection through WAFs and CDNs, the whole gamut. My responsibility is to look at security across the entire scope of all the organizational groups within GoDaddy and identify what are the solutions that we should be introducing either by default or introducing as a product line. In addition to that, as part of the security business unit head, I'm also responsible for security, which is one of the companies that I co-founded with Daniel, Sid, and Dre many, many moons ago, and was recently acquired by GoDaddy. So,
Cool. So I think the one thing that I thought was really interesting what you said is that contrast between what things you have on by default versus our products that you sell people. How do
mhm.
you think about that tension and
Yeah, so
kind of
yeah, it's a really interesting question, right? It's actually something that I've been placing a lot of energy on over on the GoDaddy side, because I believe that as service providers we have a responsibility to help individuals get online with a secure online presence by default, right? I think that WordPress has done a phenomenal job in kind of pushing that direction. We've seen them do things like stronger passwords by default, right? And just some of the configurations, the changes they make. But I think that we could do a better job. Doing a better job, I think, falls on the service providers, not necessarily on the platform, right? Like the platform should be responsible for some of those
yeah.
things. That being said, I think that service providers, when they're providing especially a managed solution, we have the ability to break out security into two distinct domains, right? We have those configuration security and we have the service security. And on the configuration side, my general belief is that you have to get online and make minor changes by default, whether that's ensuring admin is not used or ensuring that WP config has the appropriate prefixes for databases. Like, why do you as a user have to think about that, right? Those are stupid little
Yeah.
configuration changes that should just be done by default. And so I asked myself, well, why don't we as a platform do that, right? Or even more practical changes like disabling editing on the front end WP admin, or making it off by default and force the user to activate. And so to make the user aware
Mhm.
that they're making a choice that could potentially contribute to their security. I think an interesting thing that I've been thinking a lot about is 2FA, right? I hate the fact that we even have to have this conversation or 2FA, MFA. It should just be default. I understand that the platform can't do it, but why can't service providers dictate that? Right? I think another,
That's really
yeah,
interesting.
like we should be able to go out by default and define, okay, well, this is what 2FA is going to be on WordPress, right? Or even things like a big thing that's been going on recently is like supply chain poisoning, right? In other words, you
Mhm.
take it's the concept of own one, own them all. Identify a repository where everybody pulls from, poison that with some malicious code that serves up spam or connects to a command and control center or something along those lines. And then it just kind of, if you get it into the repo, boom, you win, right? Because then it updates to hundreds of thousands of sites, and then now they have an issue, and it's like, oh my God, how did this get here? It's at the repo. We got to go back. It's a pain in the ass, right? I think that service providers have a way to address that. I also think things like auto updates. Again, I don't think that at the platform level we can do that, but I think that service providers have a certain level of control, granularity of the environment that would facilitate some form of auto updates and restoration in the event something breaks, right? So why don't we do
Yeah.
that, right? So that's a part of security that I think is things that we can think of from a default security kind of configuration security that a user should never have to worry about, right? Those are things that we can do to kind of simplify that process. And then there's another side of security that requires some form of feed or intelligence to keep it updated, kind of abreast of all the emerging threats. And I call that more like the services-based security or the value-based security. And I think that
Mhm.
there's one piece that comes in by default and one that isn't by default. And it's for those users that, yes, I consciously want to think about this advanced feature, I enable it, and they pay some fee for that, right? So there's this free component and auto default, and there's this other component that takes them just one layer further. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about it, and how I think that um, we over here in GoDaddy can actually help improve the ecosystem, right? And by pushing and leading the direction for other service providers. So that's a really long response to a very short question. I apologize for that.
Oh no, no worries. That's really interesting because there is that tension of like making sure that service providers are making WordPress as secure as they can without
Yes.
people having to understand or think about WordPress security. And
Yeah,
historically, it's been the case that people have had to think about WordPress security. And
it
I think
is.
the trend is definitely in the direction of they don't have to as much as service providers get more thoughtful and intentional about the way they host WordPress.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this is that I wrote an article a couple years back where I essentially spoke to the divide between the customer's expectations around security and the service provider's expectation around where their responsibility is with security. And it's always interesting, right? Because as a service provider, being that now I work for one of the largest ones, right? I sit there and I think,
Hmm.
wow, we're doing a lot from a security standpoint. But then as the consumer, they're buying it and they're like, well, no, I paid you to do these additional things. And what usually happens is that the consumer doesn't realize that there is a point at which security is no longer the host responsibility and it's now theirs as the customer. The problem is that as a community we just don't never we never
Yeah.
really have that conversation with the buyer. It's like we're so worried about the marketing, the design, and the SEO and all the revenue generating functions that those ancillary functions like security just don't come up until like, oh my God, at the end, yes, have you considered security, right? And then that's just always the
Yeah.
bad time. And they're like, yeah, 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 no problem, I'll take care of that. So it's a tough
Yeah.
one.
It's a really good point. So, with respect to actually dealing with security, I think people who aren't even on GoDaddy might want to use security services and
Right.
plugins. So, what exactly does security offer with respect to keeping WordPress websites more secure?
Yeah, definitely. So that's a great point. So Sukuti, as I mentioned, was acquired, but we continue to run on our own and go to market, and we continue to acquire new customers along the way. And that's essentially for all those customers that don't host with GoDaddy, that host with any number of service providers. And that was intentional, right? The platform was always built to be platform agnostic and independent intentionally. And what's really curious about it is when I explain to folks what Sukuti is, I always talk to it in the terms of a platform, right? It's a platform that's built of a series of security controls that are all cloud-based. They're all designed to enable the user to create a more secure posture online. And so we look at things like virtual patching and virtual hardening, right? We recognize that it's very difficult for a user to sometimes stay ahead of the latest threats, right? Or maybe apply
Hmm.
the latest updates. And so our technology allows them to patch it for them at the edge, or what's known as the edge, right? So we're also able to mitigate external attacks, whether that's exploitation attempts, whether that's DDoS attacks, in other words, trying to attack the availability of the site. But that's usually the one piece that most people are like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I understand that. I think the piece that sometimes other website owners kind of forget about or stop thinking about is there's when you think about security, it's a multifaceted process, right? You've got protection,
Hmm.
detection, response, you have business continuity, you have all these pieces in there. And so our platform
Yeah.
and every one of us, the tools within our suite is designed to solve one of those problems, right? So on the front end, it's the protection side, right? But we subscribe to the methodology that we recognize that no one tool in security is a 100% solution. And so the odds are something at some point is going to happen for a variety of reasons. So we have a monitoring and detection tool set within the platform, and that's continuously looking for what we call like indicators of compromise. Has something happened? Has something not happened? And then, then we have what's also known as the incident response team, and those guys are designed, or that team is designed to go in and address if there is some nefarious activity, right? Because and our general approach was, well, we wanted to provide the user with the most comprehensive suite so that if anything happens around security, we're there, right? We know that they don't want to keep going and talking to different folks. It's just like a one-stop shop, right? Um, for WordPress specifically, one of the things, and all this is platform agnostic. So we work across WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, and it was designed intentionally that way. Um, the one thing we do specifically for WordPress is our security plugin. And what's interesting
Hmm.
is that we have fundamentally different ideology around what should happen at the application versus what should happen at the cloud. And so sometimes a user will go and do a side-by-side comparison with like our security plugin versus other security plugins. The problem is that when you think of the security plugin ecosystem, every one of the tool sets are designed to have different functions, right? Some are
Hmm.
utilities, some are forensic, some are detection, some are protection, some are all encompassing. Um, I always like to think of ours more from an auditing and logging perspective. There are some hardening
Yeah.
features that we do in the plugin. There are some hooks into the WAF and protection if they want to view that. But the real power in the plugin comes in the ability to see all the activity that's happening on the site. And why I find that so important is because it brings a specific level of awareness to the consumer. And whenever I talk to small business owners, I'm always telling them, or just website owners, I'm like, look, you are the most critical piece of your entire security chain, right? You know about things before any tool does. Case in point, let's say, for instance, you have WP admin open to the world, right? You're the only admin, but
Hmm.
the idea of using proxy is just too overwhelming of a concept for you. And so you're like, well, I have to be able to open it anywhere I want. Any Starbucks I go to, I need to be able to log in. Well, if you log in the morning and you're looking at your logs just to see what's going on, and you notice that three of your posts were updated, or you notice that your user logged in at 2 a.m. from China while you were sleeping, right? Those would be what we would consider in the security ecosystem as indicators, really strong indicators that something is really messed up right now, right? Like, oh my God, how did somebody from China log in and update two of my posts, right? That's also that's a strong indicator that something's happening, and it also gives you a good trail to kind of pursue. And so the plugin was designed to be complementary with the suite of tools that we offer in our platform.
Gotcha. So as I think about it, the core platform, to use your language, is a web application firewall. Is that how you think about it, or is there a core thing that
No,
that misses?
the platform is a suite, so it's got the protection, detection, and response components to it, right? I don't you shouldn't think of the platform in singularities. Like, it's not just the protection, it's not just the detection, and it's not just the response. In fact, it's all those components together, and in fact, it has a backup component to it as well.
Mm,
So it's really, really important that we think about it from that perspective.
cool.
The big thing I don't want website owners to think about it is just, oh, I only need protection, or oh, I only need detection, or oh, I only need instant response. That's actually where we usually go wrong.
Yeah, can you say how is that going wrong? I think you're correct, but say a
Yeah.
little bit more about why that is inadequate.
Yeah, so the reason I think that that leads us astray is because security, it implies that security is a very linear process when it's not,
Hmm.
right? It's one is a continuous process, and it's a cyclical process. It's one that you want to continuously come and look at. Um, Philosophically, I don't think that anybody should ever subscribe to the idea of a easy button when it comes to security. Like, if I just do this one thing, I'll never have to worry about security again. And when you think about it in singularities around one specific tool set or one specific feature, that's essentially what you're doing. And you start creating what I consider to be very bad behaviors. And in security, we already have a challenge with behaviors, right? We have behavioral problems because it's not a revenue generating function. It's something that we know we need to do, but nobody really wants to do it. And the only time anybody really wants to do it is when they feel the pain. In other words, Google's blacklisted you, or you're losing
Hmm.
customers, right? So
Yeah.
anything that I could ever do to change and adapt human behavior is kind of at the core of what I like to achieve, because that, for me, pays longer dividends over time, right? Um, so that's, in a nutshell, why I think that that's just not the right approach.
Yeah. So when you think about the platform, I think you've already just started to address this, but what are the limits of what security or anything else can do?
Yeah.
Where are people still needing to be active even if they buy the service?
Yeah, that's a great point, right? One of the things that we always like to talk to the customers is, like, while we like to provide as much of a white glove solution as possible, there is a level of responsibility on you as the website owner, and any organization that tells you otherwise is essentially lying to you. And I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Um, One of the biggest issues that I see is around human behavior, right? I can deploy every tool I want, but if you are going to persist on using weak user password combinations, there's very little that I can do about that. I mean, I can deploy tools to help mitigate that by restricting access to the admin through IP authentication
Hmm.
and things like that. But let's face it, for the everyday website owner, that is highly unlikely, right? I can provide you tools around 2FA, but the odds are you'll maybe deploy it for yourself, or you won't deploy it for everybody else. I
Hmm.
could give you guidance around, you shouldn't have, if you have 20 users, all 20 shouldn't be admins, but it's on you to deploy and manage that, right? Another interesting thing that we don't do anything about and falls really on the users is kind of general mindset and maintenance of your local environment. One of the things that hosting providers can do is they'll provide you a one-to-many relationship between the account and the number of domains you can manage, right? So I can have a domain here in my shared hosting here with GoDaddy, and in it I can have 100 domains. Well, my tools will protect you from external attacks. They won't protect you from internal attacks. And so if you've got 50 domains and you block 5 domains, you're not protecting yourself against cross-site contamination, right? So there's those kind of behavioral problems that I don't believe any tool can get around. But I do think that service providers can do a lot to curb those behavioral problems. Like, for
Mm.
instance, I mentioned this earlier where, well, what if I enforce 2FA? What if I enforce functional isolation, not just at the account level, but at the domain level within the account, right? What
Mhm.
if we disable PHP execution by default? What if we disable editing by default, right? You start doing all these little things where you discourage behavioral problems. And then what happens if, imagine a world where we can lead the charge and have other service providers do it, where we're no longer even talking about secure by default. It's just second nature, right? People just like, oh, eventually you can imagine a world like, oh, I didn't even you could do that anymore because it's always shut off by default, right? Like, for me, that would be a success.
That's a really interesting and tough tension, because at some point, like, someone wants file editing and it's off by default, and they're like, "Oh, I hate you." I hate that
That's right.
GoDaddy always blocks file editing because I want to use it to change a style or a build tag or whatever.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll have to balance out, right? We'll have to figure out how do we provide and how do we continue to balance that convenience and that security paradigm that we're always
Hmm.
in, right? And so these are just random thoughts, things that are going through my head in ways that I think we
Yeah.
can, help provide some thought leadership in the space around what a default security configuration could be for the ecosystem.
So one thing that I did want to ask you about that you mentioned is cross-site contamination. So you have a
Mhm.
WordPress site that has never been updated, and you have a WordPress site that is up to date. And so one gets
Yeah.
attacked and potentially it can compromise the other. Do you think of that as purely within one person's hosting account? Has there ever been cases, to your knowledge, of, on this GoDaddy shared server was compromised because someone else's, or, other companies? Does that
Oh
happen?
yeah. Oh yeah, it has in the past. I think it even happened here at GoDaddy many, many moons ago, back in like 2010, 2011. But it's no longer 2010, 2011, right? I think a lot of
Right.
service providers um, have learned about configuration and the challenges and stuff like that. Uh, for the most part these days, the lateral movement that I see is within accounts, with exception to uh, the would-be hosts, right? And what I mean by the would-be hosts is, like, I don't think you see these from like the large brands, EIGs, Web.com, the GoDaddies of the world, right? You see this from, Joe's agency boutique that happens to have a hosting environment, and their hosting environment is comprised of like one AWS configuration with a cPanel
Yeah.
deployment that is poorly configured and provides for lateral movement. And in fact, these types of hosts, this segment of hosts, actually gives a bad name to all hosts, right? Because that's where we
Right.
see most of our issues, right? At this very low level tier, up and coming hosts that are trying to become hosts that haven't learned from their previous mistakes. The
Right.
larger hosts these days have implemented pretty good controls and processes to help mitigate these things based on what happened, many years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the tension I feel about that is, like, I like the idea of supporting, local businesses, but I also trust companies like GoDaddy and EIG and who've been around a while to have
Yeah.
made sure that they're doing these controls so that, my shared account cannot access someone else's or vice versa.
There's
So
something
it's
to
a
be
really,
said.
like,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I was just saying there's something to be said about some of the larger brands these days. Now that I work for one too, I get to see it. It's like there's a lot that goes into thinking about security for the small business user. Um, and it's something that's just baked in. And I work with a lot of small hosts, up and coming, or service providers that are not hosts, but they market host because it's just easy attach on the back end from a maintenance and sustainment standpoint, right? And then the one that ends up suffering is actually the website owner. because something
Right.
happens and it's like, oh, how did this happen? And like, well, we didn't have the control, or it's like the CEO is the sysadmin, right? And he's the sales guy and the marketing guy, and I get it. I've been there.
Right.
You know what I mean? It presents a challenge.
Hmm. Absolutely. All right. So to shift gears, what things do you think a WordPress site owner or developer should do to make sure that a WordPress site is secure? How do you think about that challenge and what do you do about it?
Yeah, so very good question. I think that what I've been doing as of late, I just gave a talk at WordCamp in Sacramento where what I challenge the website owners is I don't want you to think about every possible security configuration that you can make, right? That's not how I want you to think about security. What I want you to think about security is in terms of um, uh, focus on like maybe the top two, three things that you can do that has the biggest impact. And for me, those top two, three things are focusing on your access control by default, right? What are the tools that you can implement, and what are the good behaviors like least privileged and stuff like that? In other words, giving people the access they require to do the things that they need. In other words, not everybody needs to be an admin. Um,
Right.
you know, uh, how can you integrate things like 2FA into your everyday behavior? The other thing I would encourage them to think about is so access control is one of the leading uh, vectors of use for compromises. The second is exploitation of vulnerabilities, right? I think that the real easy response from a security person is always like, oh, just update. But the reality of it is, if it was easy to update, then you wouldn't have things like Equifax, right? Updates is just fundamentally difficult for a variety of reasons. It's not the technical action of updating that's difficult. It's
Right.
all the impacts of if an upgrade goes wrong, right? Because nobody wants to be part of that 0.1% statistic that broke the site, right? And I can guarantee you it'll always happen just as you're going live. So I think you want to start thinking about the technologies that help you stay ahead of not just the known knowns, in other words, vulnerabilities that have been patched that you can update, but also about the unknown unknowns, which is where like firewalls come into play to help you kind of mitigate those things. I think that if you can focus on those two areas, access control and vulnerability exploitation, you will reduce your overall threat exposure. And instead of telling you like 10, 15, 20 things to do, focus on those. And those things you'll find are probably really hard to do regardless. Once you're done with those, then we can get into other conversation, other things that I want you to look at, right? To help improve your overall security posture. And as of late, that's kind of how I've been approaching the world. And I approach it more from how we ran the business and how we execute things. Like anytime somebody came to me with like 10, 15 great ideas, I know that we only ever executed like two of them, right?
That's a
And so
really good point.
yeah, when you think about it, so focus on two, three things, then come back at me and I'll give you some more recommendations. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
That's
So
just my
once you
approach.
understand and have an answer to, you know, vulnerabilities and to how do I make sure that everyone's got a strong password and has only the access they need and so on, then the next steps make sense.
Yeah, and an interesting way to think about this is from a risk standpoint, right? Security is all about risk management. In other words, risk will never
Hmm.
be zero, right?
Right.
And so, uh, for instance, a good thought exercise for any of your listeners would be, okay, maybe you're creating an e-commerce site. Okay, well, if you're creating an e-commerce site, then what are the things that you need to be concerned about? Well, the biggest concern you're going to have is around credit cards, and then associated with that, you're going to have compliance issues around PCI, right? And so that's going to drive your security mindset. Okay. Maybe you're creating a basic brochureware site. And the biggest response I always get from website owners is like, well, I just have a basic little site and it doesn't generate any revenue and it doesn't do anything for me. And I'm like, well, think about that, right? I know you said it doesn't generate any revenue, and I know you say you don't really care about it. Then why do you have it up? You put it up for a reason. It's doing something. Oh, it's just my brand. Okay, well, how much is your brand worth to you? Oh, it's not worth much to me. I was like, well, the one thing I can tell you is that it's never worth anything to you until it is worth something to you, right? And usually that worth comes when your traffic dies, you get no more leads, you get no more emails, you get no nothing, and then all of a sudden you realize how valuable it was for you. And so even if you're creating a brochure website, maybe the question is, what are the things that are riskiest to you that would cause an impact? And maybe that response is, well, I can never afford to lose my SEO from this site, right? Because maybe it's
Hmm.
referral, affiliate, whatever. I can never afford to get blacklisted, right? And maybe those are the things that you just don't want. And so now you think through, okay, well, how do I ensure that doesn't happen? What do I need to be doing to ensure that those things that I'm most concerned about occur? right? Maybe you're building a social platform. Well, as a social platform, maybe you're collecting sensitive information for customers, and the risk is you want people to feel confident that when they're giving you their data, that it's not going to be lost. Okay, well, how's encryption going to work? Right? How's
Mm-hmm.
end-to-end encryption going to work? How's encryption at rest going to work? How are you going to store this data? What are you going to do with this data? Are there any requirements around HIPAA if you're collecting any sensitive information around health? Right? So by understanding the specific type of application, website you're trying to build can start helping you think about how you should think about security based on what your general risk position is. And there's going to be instances where you're just going to accept the risk. You're going to be like, well, that's a low level risk situation. And so I accept it. And you just do risk acceptance, right? And sometimes maybe you're a PCI,
Mm-hmm.
e-commerce, and you're like, well, I'm going to defer that risk. And I want Recurly or Stripe or somebody else to handle the storage and collection and management of the credit card information, right? But those are just some of the
Mm-hmm.
thought processes you're going to go through as you're building these sites and different ways to think about security.
Yeah. So I think the point that I'm taking away from what you're saying is that you need to think about it holistically and consider what actual risks exist for you before you can really come to these are the things you should do. Because some things that make sense in some contexts might not make sense in yours, for example.
That's exactly right. There's not a fit all, and you don't want to treat it from a checklist perspective, right? Checklists are good to kind of help your thought process. They're not good. You don't want to
Right.
just check them off and assume you're good, right? The one story I always like to tell folks is like, in some enterprises, they used to have this checklist, like, oh, you must have firewall. So they'd go buy a firewall and they put it into the rack and they turn it on, like, boom, firewall set. And you're like, fuck my life. Like, dude, you got to configure it. You got to do this. You got to do all these things. You got to add the rules. Like, oh, okay. And then they go add that and then it works. So,
Yeah. So understanding the reason you're doing something is also really
absolutely.
important, because if you just do it out of a checklist, you might not understand its impact or its value or its risks,
Yeah.
and where it fails for you. Point, because, I think a common, modern answer to WordPress security is like, oh, well, I have, iTheme security, I have security, I have SiteLock, and I'm
Yeah.
set. But that doesn't protect you from your password was literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's no help for you.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we used to joke. It's like, hey, look, if you're not willing to think about security a little bit beyond just technologies deploying, even if they're security, then maybe you shouldn't sign up for us. Maybe go sign up for one of our competitors or whatnot, because you're just not the right customer for us, right? When you do a marriage with us and you leverage our tools, for us, it's a marriage, it's a relationship that we're going to have. Yes, we'll do 75, 80% of the work, but we're also depending, in order for us to be successful, it requires a certain level of engagement from you as well.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right. Well, Tony, I really appreciate you taking the time. I think that is a lot of very good advice. And I think the core thing I take away from this is the thinking about it, what's important to you versus any like checklist or an item that you want to accomplish.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, I hope that this was helpful, right? I'm sorry for talking so fast.
No worries. All right. See you soon.